How do ancient spiritual traditions really grapple with the incredible complexity that modern science keeps uncovering? I mean, for centuries, people have wondered about the origins of life, right? And lately, this quest often brings faith and science into this really fascinating, sometimes, let's be honest, challenging dialogue. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your questions, your sources, and we really unpack them to get to the core insights. Today, we're diving deep into the, very complex and multifaceted discussion around Islam and evolution. Our main guide here is a recent work by Shoaib Ahmed Malik. He critically examines this whole debate, but through the lens of a giant in Islamic intellectual history, Al-Ghazali. So what you'll gain is a really nuanced understanding of how different perspectives, both scientific and theological, approach this. We'll try to cut through some common misconceptions, maybe highlight some surprising points where people agree, and offer you frameworks, actual tools for thinking about these huge questions yourself. You should leave not just, informed, but better equipped to navigate this kind of complex information. Okay, let's unpack this. Because, it's not every day you get to bring a medieval thinker into a conversation with cutting-edge biology. It sounds dense, I know, but the aim here, and what the author, Malik, does so well, is make it accessible and really, really interesting. It's quite something.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is how Malik uses Al-Ghazali's deep philosophical commitments, his interpretive methods, to tackle a very modern problem. It gives you this fresh, really thought-provoking perspective on whether a real reconciliation between Islam and evolution isn't just possible, but maybe even sort of built into some traditional ways of thinking.
Okay, so to really get why this debate is so compelling, we first need to be clear on what modern evolutionary science actually says. Because the way we use the word evolution day to day can be pretty different from the scientific meaning. That's often where the confusion starts, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's a key point. Colloquially, evolution can just mean change or maybe positive development, like a company strategy evolving.
Right.
But scientifically, it's much more specific. We're talking mainly about the interplay of two things: random mutation and natural selection. These two are the bedrock of what we call neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis. It's a very particular kind of change mechanism.
Right. And when we talk about evolution in that scientific sense, we're often dealing with timescales that are just, incredibly hard for us to wrap our heads around. Deep time. We're not talking centuries here, we're talking eons. Can you maybe give us a sense of these huge durations?
Yeah, deep time, it refers to periods stretching into billions of years. Just for context, Earth itself formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And the earliest solid evidence we have for life, that goes back to around 3.5 billion years ago. Now, to put that in perspective, try this. Imagine if the Earth had formed just 145.9 years ago, like mid-19th century. On that timescale, the earliest humans would have appeared on Earth only about 2.3 days ago.
Wow. Okay, that really hits home.
Yeah, it highlights just how gradual this process is.
Yeah.
Evolution needs millions upon millions of years to unfold.
That deep time analogy is super helpful. So, okay, if it's this incredibly slow, gradual process over billions of years, how do we get new species? And what does the pattern look like? Is it that, that classic straight line image of an ape slowly standing up and turning into a human?
The March of Progress image. That's one of the biggest misconceptions out there. First, let's clarify species. Scientifically, it generally means organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So, speciation is the process where a population diverges over time, usually because they're separated somehow, until they become distinct new species that can't interbreed anymore. Think of it like this, maybe. Imagine you have squirrels in a valley. Then a huge earthquake splits the valley, creates a massive barrier, maybe a river or a canyon. And maybe the environments on each side become quite different. Over millions of years, the separated squirrel groups adapt to their own sides. They accumulate different genetic changes, random mutations, filtered by natural selection for what works best there. Eventually, they become so genetically different that even if that barrier disappeared, they couldn't successfully breed.
Okay, so they've diverged.
Exactly. That's divergent evolution, leading to new species. And it's definitely not a straight line. It's more like a branching tree. Evolution involves change over time, sure, but it's driven by probabilistic mechanisms. There's no predetermined path, no straight line of progress. That image of human evolution, it's misleading. It's better to think of it as representing ancestral lines, with branches splitting off, not one thing turning directly into the next in a neat sequence.
That makes so much more sense. Not a ladder, but a bush, maybe?
A bush or a complex tree, exactly. So with that process and those timescales in mind, where do scientists find the most compelling evidence? What's the proof?
Yeah, what does the evidence actually say?
Well, the evidence comes from multiple independent lines that all point in the same direction. The fossil record paleontology is a big one. The Earth's crust has layers, right? Stratified. Older layers are deeper down, so digging deeper is literally looking further back in time. And the fossil record generally shows simpler organisms in older layers and increasing complexity as you move to more recent layers. Darwin didn't have a perfect fossil record, but it's become vastly stronger since then. A classic example is Pachycetus.
Pachycetus?
Yeah, a fossil found in Pakistan. It was a land mammal, but its skeletal structure, especially the skull, shows these clear incremental changes over millions of years leading towards modern whales. It's a beautiful transitional sequence. And beyond fossils, you have homology, looking at similarities in anatomy or DNA that suggest common ancestry. And of course, modern genetics gives us incredibly powerful evidence too.
It's easy to get the impression Darwin just, conjured this whole idea out of thin air. But like most huge scientific shifts, it didn't happen in a vacuum. There is a history. Ideas came before, challenges came after. What was the thinking before Darwin?
Right, context is key. Before Darwin, a dominant idea in the West, scientifically and philosophically, was the great chain of being, the GCB. Think of it as a ladder, a hierarchy from God down through angels, humans, animals, plants, minerals. Everything had its fixed place. And crucially, species were seen as fixed, unchanging things. A cat was always a cat, a human always a human. Biological change between species, considered impossible. Then you had thinkers like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, just before Darwin, really. He offered one of the first coherent evolutionary theories, though it was quite different from Darwin's. Lamarck thought animals had this sort of internal drive towards complexity. And he proposed the law of use and disuse, like the giraffe stretching its neck, making it longer. And he believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics that stretched neck could be passed on. Big difference, though. Lamarck didn't really believe in common ancestry. He thought life sort of spontaneously arose all the time, starting new ladders of complexity.
Interesting. So different ladders, not a single tree.
Exactly. Then comes Darwin in 1859 on the origin of species. What made his idea revolutionary was the emphasis on natural selection. He was inspired by artificial selection. You know how farmers breed animals for certain traits. Nature, he argued, does something similar, selecting organisms best suited to survive and reproduce in their environment. He didn't know about genes, though. He had this idea called pangenesis, tiny particles called gemmules shed by organs collected in the sex cells to pass on traits. A bit off, but he knew inheritance was key.
And it wasn't smooth sailing for Darwin's ideas initially, right? There were challenges.
Oh, definitely. Big challenges. Philosophically, the idea of teleology, purpose in the universe, was shaken. If evolution was just about environmental pressure and inheritance, where was God's plan? It seemed to some to make humans just a lucky accident, which was deeply unsettling.
And morality, too.
Yes, that was huge. The phrase survival of the fittest, actually coined by Herbert Spencer, not Darwin, raised alarms about objective morality. People worried it could justify horrible things. And, unfortunately, evolutionary ideas were misused to support things like eugenics, certain political ideologies, even justify vices. A lot of baggage got attached.
So how did Darwinism eventually become the standard model?
Several things came together. The big one was genetics. When Mendel's work on inheritance was rediscovered in the early 20th century and then integrated with Darwin's ideas in the 1930s, that solved the inheritance puzzle. That combination, Mendelian genetics plus natural selection, is what we call neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis. Plus, the fossil record kept getting better, showing extinctions clearly, which Lamarckism struggled with. And then radioactivity dating confirmed the Earth was incredibly old, 4.6 billion years, giving evolution the time it needed. These converging lines of evidence basically solidified the evolutionary framework and pushed out competing ideas.
Okay, so that brings us pretty much up to date scientifically. The sources we looked at emphasize that today, most biologists absolutely agree on common ancestry. That's the bedrock. The debate now, then, isn't if evolution happened, but more about the how. Like nuances within the theory, neo-Darwinism versus maybe an extended evolutionary synthesis. This seems really key.
It is absolutely key. That's a crucial distinction that often gets completely lost in public debates, unfortunately. The fundamental reality of evolution, the fact of common descent, is as well established in science as anything gets. The active, healthy scientific debate today is about the finer points, the relative importance of different mechanisms like natural selection versus genetic drift, or the role of developmental processes. It's refinement within the paradigm, not a questioning of the paradigm itself.
That clarity is so important for anyone trying to follow this.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's pivot a bit and tackle some common objections people raise against evolution. You've probably heard them all. One of the most frequent is, evolution is just a theory. How do we respond to that?
Yeah, that one comes up a lot. And it usually shows a misunderstanding of what theory means in science. Colloquially, sure, a theory can be a guess, a hunch. My theory is the traffic was bad. But in science, a theory is, well, it's much bigger. It's a well-substantiated, comprehensive explanation for some aspect of the natural world. It's built on a huge body of evidence, repeatedly confirmed through observation and experiment.
So it's not just a guess?
Not at all. Calling evolution just a theory is like saying gravity is just a theory or germ theory is just a theory. It misunderstands the scientific weight of the term. It's actually a high level of scientific understanding.
Got it. Another objection you sometimes hear is that evolution isn't falsifiable, that it can explain anything, so it's unscientific according to, like, Karl Popper's idea.
Right, the falsifiability criterion. But evolution is absolutely falsifiable. For a theory to be falsifiable, there just needs to be some conceivable observation that could prove it wrong. We don't have to have found it, but it has to be possible. For evolution, oh, definitely. Imagine finding a fossilized rabbit in rocks from the Precambrian era before complex animals are supposed to exist. That would blow the theory apart.
Like finding a modern mammal way, way back in time.
Exactly. Or if we found that genetic sequences consistently contradicted the branching pattern of life predicted by evolution, that would falsify it too. The reason the theory has what we call significant epistemic inertia, meaning it's really robust and widely accepted, is precisely because it has survived countless potential falsifications. The evidence is just overwhelmingly strong.
Okay, what about the fossil record being gappy? People say, if there are gaps, how can you be sure about the connections?
That's a fair question, and scientists are the first to admit the fossil record is incomplete. Fossilization itself is a really rare event. Specific conditions are needed. Most things that die don't fossilize. Bones get scattered, decay happens. So yes, there are gaps. However, despite that, we have found an incredible number of fossils. Think about those whale transitions like Pakicetus or Tiktaalik, that amazing fossil linking fish and land animals.
So the gaps don't invalidate the fossils we do have.
Precisely. And crucially, the fossil record isn't the only line of evidence. It's powerfully backed up by completely independent evidence from genetics, from biogeography, where species live, from comparative anatomy, homology. When all these different independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion, common descent, that's called consilience of induction, it makes the overall case incredibly strong, even with gaps in one line of evidence.
Okay, here's a really big one, especially when faith comes into the picture. The idea that if evolution involves randomness, it undermines God's power, God's knowledge. It makes humans seem like a lucky accident, not a purposeful creation. How do you address that?
Right, the randomness issue. There are a couple of responses. First, scientifically, some argue evolution might not be as completely wide open and random as that objection implies. Think about convergent evolution, where similar traits evolve independently in different lineages, like eyes have evolved multiple times. This suggests that maybe certain outcomes are quite probable, perhaps even inevitable, given certain environmental pressures.
So maybe not pure chance dictating everything.
Possibly. But more fundamentally, from a theological perspective, the argument that chance processes somehow limit God just doesn't hold water, especially within many traditional theologies. A universe that operates with probabilistic elements, with what looks like chance from our perspective, doesn't mean God isn't in control or doesn't know the outcome. It's perfectly conceivable that an omniscient, omnipotent God could use processes involving chance and probability to achieve his intended purposes. To think otherwise is sort of imposing human limitations onto God, isn't it? Suggesting God can only work through strictly deterministic means.
Like God needs everything to be predictable to us for it to be planned by him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
God can orchestrate creation through means that appear random to us, yet still fulfill his ultimate design. And this ties directly into a really critical distinction we need to make. Philosophical naturalism versus methodological naturalism.
Yes, this feels important. Because the issue often isn't evolution itself, but the philosophical spin people put on it.
Precisely. Philosophical naturalism, PN, is a worldview. It's the belief that nature is all there is. No God, no supernatural realm, full stop. Methodological naturalism, MN on the other hand, is about the method of science. It simply says that science, to work as science, can only study and explain things using natural causes and laws. It has to remain silent on the supernatural within its own framework.
So science looks for natural explanations because that's what it can look for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A theist, someone who believes in God, can perfectly comfortably adopt methodological naturalism when doing or evaluating science. They can see evolution as a description of how God works in the natural world to bring about life's diversity, without that description denying God's ultimate reality or role. The conflict only really arises if you slide from MN into PN and claim evolution proves there's no God. That's a philosophical leap, not a scientific conclusion.
That's a really useful tool separating the science from the philosophical interpretation. Okay, so evolution as a theory emerged in a broadly Christian cultural context. Let's briefly touch on how Christian thinkers responded before we really dive into the Islamic perspectives. The sources outline about 4 main Christian stances.
Yes, and they show a real specter of engagement. First, you have young Earth creationism, YEC. This is the most resistant position. YECs reject evolution entirely. They typically interpret Genesis literally. Earth is maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years old. There was a global flood. God created distinct kinds of creatures directly, no common ancestry. For them, evolution poses serious theological problems, like death existing before Adam and Eve's fall, which they feel undermines the need for Jesus' redemption. Think Ken Ham.
Okay, very literal. What's next?
Then there's Old Earth creationism, OEC. These thinkers accept the scientific consensus on the Earth's great age, billions of years. They might interpret the Genesis days as long ages, for instance, day age view, or see gaps in the timeline, gap theory. But crucially, they still generally reject common ancestry, especially for humans. They believe God intervened to create different kinds of life at different points over those long ages. Hugh Ross is a prominent OEC voice.
So, old Earth, but still special creation events.
All right. Third is intelligent design, ID. ID presents itself more as a scientific argument against certain aspects of neo-Darwinism, rather than a purely religious position initially. Its proponents argue some biological systems exhibit irreducible complexity. Michael Behe used the mousetrap or the bacterial flagellum as examples. Remove one part and the whole thing stops working. They argue this points to an intelligent designer. Critics push back, arguing those parts might have had other functions earlier in evolution, or the complexity can evolve step by step. There's also concern ID might stop scientific inquiry by just saying a designer did it. ID tries to be worldview neutral, not explicitly linking the designer to the Christian God necessarily.
Interesting. And the last one.
The fourth is theistic evolution, TE, sometimes called evolutionary creationism. This position fully accepts the scientific findings of evolution, including common ancestry for all life, including humans. They believe God used, and is using, the evolutionary process to create. They tend to have more flexible interpretations of Genesis, perhaps metaphorical, or about theological truths rather than scientific accounts. Adam and Eve might be symbolic, or maybe historical figures chosen from an existing population. They see God's action as being within the natural processes, perhaps orchestrating them. Groups like Biologos, with figures like Deborah Harzma, represent this view. They don't see a conflict between robust science and robust faith.
That's a helpful overview, really shows the range within Christianity. Now let's shift focus to the Islamic world. The book we're looking at categorizes Muslim views on evolution to 4 main stances as well. This helps us see the nuances, moving beyond just accept or reject.
It really does. And it's important to stress up front, as the author points out, that for most of these positions, the evolution of non-human life isn't seen as particularly problematic theologically. The real sticking point is almost always human origins, specifically Adam.
Okay, so what's the first category?
The first is essentially creationism. Similar to YEC in some ways, it rejects all common ancestry, human and non-human. The reasons vary. Some are scientific objections, people like Zakir Naik arguing evolution is just a theory, or Harun Yahya focusing on supposed scientific flaws. Yahya also controversially links evolution to pagan origins and sees chance as incompatible with Islam. Others have metaphysical reasons, like Syed Hossein Nasr or Osman Bakar, who adhere to more traditional Neoplatonic ideas of fixed essences for species, or Muzaffar Iqbal, emphasizing divine design. And then there are strong theological arguments focusing on human uniqueness and dignity, insisting Adam's creation story in the Quran must be taken literally, not metaphorically. Thinkers like Sayyid Nursi, Maududi, al-Budi held this view. Nuha Mim Keller also raises concerns about falsifiability and what random evolution implies for human consciousness.
So a complete rejection based on various grounds. What's the next view?
The second is called human exceptionalism. This view is interesting because it accepts evolution for non-human life. But it maintains that Adam, seen as the first true human, and all his descendants, were created miraculously by God, without parents. Figures like Yasir Qadhi and Nazir Khan compose this. They might argue Adam was created miraculously, but with the right biology to fit into the world seamlessly, almost invisibly from a purely scientific viewpoint. For them, Adam's creation is a matter of the gaib, the unseen, the realm beyond empirical science. So you can preserve the traditional Adam story without having to reject the science of evolution for everything else.
Okay, so evolution applies just not to Adam and his direct line.
Essentially, yes. The third position is Adamic exceptionalism. This is even more nuanced. It accepts non-human evolution and the evolution of humans from earlier hominids, but it holds that only Adam's creation was a unique, miraculous event. And crucially, Adam isn't necessarily seen as the first biological human in this view.
So there could have been other human-like beings around.
Yes. David Solomon Jalahel uses the Islamic legal principle of tawaqquf, suspending judgment when scripture is silent. He argues the Quran doesn't explicitly deny pre-Adamic hominids or humans. So Adam could have been miraculously created, perhaps as the first recipient of the divine spirit or prophethood, and his descendants then intermingled with the existing, evolved human population. Adam becomes an article of faith, separate from the scientific story of biological origins.
That's quite subtle, allowing for both. And the final stance.
The fourth is no exceptions. This position accepts evolution across the board for non-humans, for the human species developing from earlier ancestors, and for Adam himself. Proponents find ways to reconcile this with Scripture. Rana Dajani, for example, interprets Quranic terms like asan, best or most fit, in an evolutionary sense, arguing past scholars lacked the scientific context. Others, like Nifal Al-Ghassam or Israr Ahmad, make a distinction between Bashar, maybe meaning the physical, evolved hominid form, and Insan, the spiritually endowed modern human. They suggest Adam was an evolved Bashar who was then selected and given God's spirit, transforming him into the first Insan. Critics do question if this linguistic split holds up consistently in the Quran, though.
So Adam evolved biologically but had a unique spiritual event.
That's one way within the no exceptions camp. Another, like Kenner Tasselman, argues for what he calls theological agnosticism. He suggests the Quran is simply silent on the mechanism of creation, including Adam's. He might question the reliability of some hadith, prophetic traditions, about Adam's creation, suggesting they could be later influences, and interprets Quranic verses more openly. For instance, created from a single soul, nafsan wahidatan, could mean a single kind or genus, not one individual. He might even argue the Quran's comparison of Adam's creation to Jesus' creation implies Adam also had a natural birth, perhaps a mother.
Wow. Okay, that really covers a wide spectrum of thought within Islam. It's fascinating, too, how some modern thinkers actively look for evolutionary ideas within older Islamic texts, almost trying to find precursors. But the book warns about this, right? Calling it a misreading.
Yes, exactly. The author calls it the old texts, new masks issue. It's really anachronistic to claim that medieval Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun or Rumi or Al-Jiyal were talking about modern evolution. They were operating within a completely different framework, usually the great chain of being we mentioned earlier. They saw a hierarchy, maybe even a spiritual progression, but not physical transformation of species over millions of years driven by mutation and selection. Those modern interpretations often have to cherry-pick quotes or ignore the wider metaphysical context these thinkers were working in. So while some passages might sound suggestive if you squint, they really weren't talking about Darwinian evolution.
Right, context is everything. Okay, after that amazing tour of the science and the diverse theological responses, let's bring it back to Al-Ghazali himself. His philosophical approach, his way of interpreting texts, the book argues, this offers a powerful toolkit for navigating these modern dilemmas. Let's start with his metaphysics, particularly from the Asherite school he belonged to. How does that help?
Okay, the Asherite metaphysics is really key here. First, it strongly emphasizes God's absolute will, absolute knowledge, and absolute power. God chooses freely among all possibilities. Now, how does this relate to nature? Asherites developed a concept often called occasionalism. It basically says God is the only true cause, the cause of causes. What we perceive as laws of nature aren't independent powers that constrain God. They're just God's consistent habits, his usual way of acting, the Sunnat law.
So gravity works consistently because God consistently wills it to work that way.
Precisely. And a miracle is simply God choosing to act differently from his usual habit in a particular instance. Importantly, a world governed by this continuous divine action is, from the outside, empirically indistinguishable from a world governed by fixed natural laws. Science can still describe the regularities, the habits. This means God's power isn't limited by nature. Nature is utterly dependent on God's moment-by-moment sustaining will.
How does that differ from other modern attempts to reconcile God and science?
Well, many modern approaches, sometimes called the Divine Action Project, DAP, try to find gaps in scientific laws where God could act without violating those laws, maybe at the quantum level or in chaotic systems. Asherism says that's the wrong way to think about it. God isn't a cause among other causes, jostling for space within the system. God is the fundamental cause of all causes, the ground of the entire system. Science describes the how, the habits. God is the ultimate why, the agent behind the habits.
Okay, so if you adopt that Asherite view, how does it handle the challenges from evolution we discussed, like naturalism, chance, purpose?
Right. First, naturalism. From an Asherite perspective, accepting evolution described by methodological naturalism is completely unproblematic. MN just describes God's habits, the how. It doesn't make the metaphysical claim of philosophical naturalism that nature is all there is. The problem only enters if you conflate the two. Second, chance and teleology, or purpose. We already touched on this, but Asherism reinforces it. A universe operating with probabilistic elements doesn't undermine God's knowledge or purpose. God can use chance to achieve his aims and purpose. Asherites distinguish proximate goals, local scientific explanations for why a trait exists, like camouflage helping survival, from ultimate goals, the overall cosmic purpose. That ultimate purpose, why humanity exists, maybe to worship God, as the Quran says, is considered revelation-bound. You learn it from God's revelation. You don't deduce it or have it undermined by observing nature's mechanisms. God's ultimate purpose for creation is extrinsic to the mechanics. It's about the destiny of its inhabitants, like salvation.
What about the argument that evolution seems inefficient or wasteful, all those extinctions?
From an Asherite viewpoint, that's an anthropocentric complaint. Judging God's actions by human standards of efficiency is misplaced. God's omnipotence isn't constrained by such notions. He can create any kind of world. He wills. Simple or complex, efficient or wasteful by our limited standards, it's just irrelevant to his power.
That metaphysical framework really does shift the perspective. What about Al-Ghazali's approach to interpreting religious texts, his hermeneutics? How does that help with evolution, especially the Adam story?
Al-Ghazali developed a sophisticated hermeneutic, a method for interpretation. It helps define when the text must be taken literally and when figurative interpretation, call a whale, is permissible or even necessary. The absolute core doctrines, belief in God's unity, the Prophet Muhammad, the last day, and texts confirmed by mutawatir transmission, meaning they were passed down through so many channels independently that error or fabrication is inconceivable, are literally binding. They form the foundation. However, reports like Ahad Hadith, those passed down through only one or a few chains of narrators, are considered less certain. They don't typically establish core beliefs on their own and might be open to interpretation if they seem to conflict with reason or stronger evidence.
So there's a hierarchy of certainty in texts. How did he view science in relation to Scripture?
Importantly, Al-Ghazali wasn't anti-science at all. He saw fields like medicine, astronomy, mathematics as valuable, even necessary, for understanding God's creation, which the Quran itself encourages us to study. He believed the Quran contains keys to these sciences. It points towards them, but it's not a science textbook itself. It doesn't contain all knowledge of physics or biology. Its primary role is guidance.
So applying that framework to Adam's creation.
Well, the specific Quranic verses about Adam being created from dust or clay and related strong, well-authenticated hadith would likely fall into the category of texts that establish important beliefs. Under Al-Ghazali's hermeneutic, these would generally be accepted as authentic descriptions of a unique event. This supports the views of creationism, human exceptionalism, and Adamic exceptionalism, allowing them to hold Adam's parentless creation as a valid belief derived from Scripture. And because it's presented as the unique divine act, a break in the usual habits, it doesn't necessarily have to contradict the scientific understanding of how other life forms arose through God's habitual processes, i.e. evolution.
It creates space for both, in a way. Okay, one last area, morality. Evolution, especially the survival of the fittest idea, has often been seen as clashing with traditional ideas of objective morality, maybe even God's goodness. How does Al-Ghazali's thought address this?
Right, the moral challenges. First, we should acknowledge the problem of evil, POE, exists with or without evolution. Suffering and death are theological questions regardless. But evolution can seem to amplify it, highlighting what some call the problem of systemic evil, the sheer scale of suffering, predation, extinction, seemingly built into the process of life over millions of years.
It makes the problem seem structural.
It can, yes. Then there's the problem of objective morality, POM. Evolutionary ethics tries to explain why humans behave morally. Descriptive evolutionary ethics, DEE. Ideas like kin selection, helping relatives, or reciprocity, you scratch my back, can explain biological altruism. But that's not necessarily the same as true psychological altruism, consciously helping others selflessly. And whether we have innate moral rules, content nativism, is really debatable, given how much moral codes vary across cultures and time. The idea that we just have an innate capacity for morality, capacity nativism, is more accepted. Plus, you always have David Hume's is-ought gap. You can describe how things are biologically, but you can't logically jump from that description to how things ought to be morally.
So where does Al-Ghazali come in?
His response, consistent with Asherism, is quite radical here. He largely rejects the idea of objective, universal morality as humans understand it. He argued that what we perceive as good or bad is mostly learned through upbringing, experience, our own temperaments. It's relative to our goals and context. Crucially, he maintained that God's actions are simply beyond human moral judgment. God is not bound by human categories of good and evil. His will and power transcend any axiological system we might devise.
So God isn't subject to our definition of good.
Exactly. For Al-Ghazali, God's omnipotence means his actions define reality. They aren't judged by some external moral standard. This perspective essentially dissolves the conflict between evolution's apparent immorality and God's nature, because God simply isn't playing by human moral rules.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We journeyed through the science of evolution, looked at common objections, explored that wide spectrum of Christian and Islamic responses, and then we returned to Al-Ghazali, finding in his metaphysics and hermeneutics these really powerful frameworks for enabling a much more sophisticated dialogue between faith and science. This whole deep dive really shows the relationship is far from being a simple conflict, doesn't it? It's more like a rich, complex tapestry of interpretation and understanding.
Absolutely. Al-Ghazali's Asherite approach, emphasizing God's total sovereignty and the idea of nature as God's habit, offers this compelling lens. Through it, scientific findings, even tricky ones involving chance or apparent waste, can potentially be integrated without necessarily threatening core theological beliefs. And his interpretive principles offer a path for reading Scripture with both faithfulness and flexibility.
It really underscores that this isn't a straightforward battle between two opposing sides. The relationship between Islam and evolution, and really faith and science generally, is this dynamic, ongoing conversation full of nuance, full of possibility. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some useful tools to grapple with these profound questions for yourselves.
Which really leads to a final question for you to ponder. How does understanding these different perspectives, these frameworks for potential reconciliation, shape your own thinking about the harmony between scientific discovery and spiritual truth? What stands out to you as the most compelling way forward in this conversation?
And maybe consider this. How can understanding the history, the philosophy behind both the science and the religious interpretations shift what might seem like a conflict into perhaps an opportunity for much deeper insight? What new questions does all of this spark for your own journey, intellectually and spiritually?